Nigeria is a country that fights harder for its visibility abroad than it does for the visibility of its own people at home. And I think it's one of the most uncomfortable truths about the way Nigerians build things, whether that's a company, a program, a legislature, or even an entire system of governance. This is something I think about every single day across different fields and sectors. But what pushed me to finally make this video was something I came across the other day while I was scrolling through Twitter. Now, before I get into it, I don't know any of these people personally, so if I have misgendered you, I am really sorry. But because of the lack of data, I'm going according to what society considers feminine and masculine features. So MoneyPoint had posted a picture from their DreamDevs demo day, and if you don't know what that is, DreamDevs is their flagship engineering bootcamp where they take 20 of the best tech graduates in Nigeria, put them through 9 weeks of intensive training, and the top performers walk away with internships and full-time roles. As I was looking at that picture, what immediately caught my eye was just the sheer number of men in it. Now, some of you might be thinking, but MoneyPoint has a women in tech program, and I know that, and we're going to come back to it later in this video because I think it actually speaks directly to the wider point I'm trying to make, so hold that thoughts for now. Anyway, that's how I started counting everyone in the picture, and it was 19 people in the frame, and 2 of them were women, which is about a 10% representation. Quick one, those figures might actually be wrong because I just saw that a few days after the previous picture, MoneyPoint had posted another one, and in that one I counted 17 people with 4 women, which is about 24%. Then I went looking further just in case I had missed anything in my initial research. I found an earlier picture from April, which I believe is when they had initially announced this program. So in that one, there were 25 people with 7 women, which is about 28%. Right now, I'm not really sure which of these pictures, accurately reflects this program's cohort, and none of those pictures posted have like descriptions or anything. So let's just take this data with a grain of salt. My curious mind then took this further and went looking for graduation photos from some of the biggest tech programs in Nigeria. And the first thing I noticed is that this is genuinely hard to do because not all of them even hold a ceremony or post anything you can actually look at. They just, announce that we have a program, they invite people into the program, then they announce that the program is done. And that's it. And from the ones I could find, I literally sat down and started counting every single person in the picture one by one because nobody publishes this data. They'll happily tell you they trained hundreds of people, but never how many of those hundreds were women. And I think this is one of those things we genuinely need to get better at, because how are we ever supposed to know whether representation is improving if we're not even recording it? I can't sit here and tell you that last year a program had this many women and this year it has that many, because that comparison doesn't exist anywhere. And Nigeria has a real habit of not documenting the things that actually matter. Anyway, out of all the ones I found with actual pictures, there is 2 I want to call out, and the first one is Andela, which is one of the biggest names in African tech. They ran an open learning program together with Google Cloud called the Android Learning Community that supported over 2,000 people in Nigeria learning to build Android apps. Now, to be fair, this one wasn't a tiny selective cohort like MoneyPoint. It was meant to be broad and accessible, and while the entire 2,000 plus people are not in this photo from one of their Lagos meetups, the room still skewed heavily male. Out of the 101 people that I had to count multiple times to make sure I was correct, I counted 21 women, which is about a 21% representation. Let's say, a bunch of women couldn't make it for whatever reason on that particular day, and I know it sounds kind of silly, but as they've not given us data on the 2,000 plus people, this is literally all I have to go with. Then there's InterSwitch Skill-Based Academy, which is their 9-month developer training program, and the most recent intake was actually their largest ever from 20,000 applications. Not gonna lie, this one actually genuinely annoyed me the most because in their own announcement article about this cohort, they did not even state how many people were in it, which to me is very wild because this is a very basic information. Anyway, once again, I had to count the people in the picture myself, and there were 16 women out of 55 people, which is about 29%. And while I was looking at these numbers, I wanted to know if there was an actual benchmark, so like a figure set by a governing body that says this is the minimum percentage of women that should be in any given space. There is no single official benchmark for something like a tech program or the workplace specifically, which, makes sense, but there are benchmark sets for other areas, and 2 stood out to me. The first is Nigeria's own 35% affirmative action written into our national gender policy, which is for women in politics and government appointments. And on the other hand, we have the EU, which has made 40% the legal minimum for women on the boards of big listed companies. So you've got 35% on one end and 40% on the other. And I'm not saying that tech programs are now legally bound to hit this 35 or 40% numbers. Those were set for politics and corporate boards. But when there's no benchmark for the thing you're actually looking at, you have to borrow one from somewhere. And if the rough consensus for the spaces that do have rules lands somewhere between 35 and 40%, then a program running in Nigeria coming in at 10, 21 or 29% is falling short. And let me not even start start with the inclusion of people with disabilities or the hundreds of tribes that we have in that country. Anyway, let's talk about how money moves within startups, because I think the funding picture is where the full scale of this issue becomes impossible for anybody to ignore. But before I throw figures at you, I want to quickly explain how the data is grouped. So when people track startup funding by gender, they usually split it a few ways. Firstly, you have all female founding teams versus all male founding teams, which is about who actually started the company. Secondly, you have it split by the gender of the CEO, so female CEO versus male CEO. And finally, we have mixed or gender diverse teams, which means companies that have at least one woman and one man among the founders. So in 2025, African startups raised $3.2 billion in total, which was actually a 40% rebound from the year before. So the ecosystem was recovering, money was flowing back in, and of that $3.2 billion, all male founding teams raised 91%, which is over $2.9 billion, while all female founding teams raised 0.9%, which comes down to about $28.8 million. And when you split it by CEO, startups led by women raised 2.2% of that total, meaning about 98% went to companies led by men. And that 2.2% is the widest gap recorded since tracking began in 2019, which means that as the overall ecosystem recovered and more money came in, the gap didn't close, it got wider. Trust me, there is more, because we haven't even broken down what kind of funding women are actually receiving. In 2025, all women founding teams secured 20% of all grants funding, which sounds like a considerable figure until you realize that grants made up just 1.5% of all startup funding for the entire year. So women are getting a large slice of a tiny pie and almost nothing of the enormous one. And the reason this matters so much is the difference between what a grant signals and what equity signals. Because when an investor looks at your funding history, equity rounds tell a very specific story. They say that someone with real money and real presence in the ecosystem looked at your company and decided to take a financial risk on you. And every round builds on the credibility of the last one. On the other hand, a grant tells a different story, a worthy one still, but a different one. Because a grant says an institution found your work worthy of support, almost like charity. And one analyst puts it bluntly that investors often end up seeing women-led startups as charity projects rather than investments. And here's the trap, because women turn to grants in the first place precisely because equity funding is so closed off to them. But then receiving grants makes equity investors take them even less seriously, which closes that door even further. So it becomes a cycle where the only kind of capital women can access is the kind of capital that makes it harder to access every other kind of capital. So no surprise at all, the structural reason underneath all of this is that the majority of VC funds are managed by men, and research from Harvard and the World Bank has consistently shown that investors back founders who look like them. Anyway, let's bring it back home to Nigeria specifically, because in 2025, Nigerian female-led startups raised $3.3 million out of $442.8 million in total funding, which is 0.75%, the lowest share in 4 years in the largest startup ecosystem on the continent. The part that makes all of this genuinely absurd to me is that women-led startups are not a worse bet, they are frequently a better one, because the research shows that for every dollar of funding, women-founded startups generate 78 cents in revenue, while male-founded startups generate just 31 cents. Also, women-led companies tend to run with significantly lower burn rates, so this was never about returns, it was never about women not being good enough. The money is simply going somewhere else and calling itself logic. But I want to go wider than tech, because I think tech is just where this particular conversation started for me, but the same exact pattern of, who gets counted, who gets to be in the room, who gets funded, it shows up everywhere you look in Nigeria, and nowhere more clearly than in politics. Right now, women hold 3 out of 109 Senate seats in Nigeria and 14 out of 360 seats in the House of Representatives, which works out to roughly 4% of the entire legislature of a country where women are nearly half the population. And what makes that number even harder to see to it is the direction it has moved over time. 1999, when Nigeria returned to democracy, women held 3% of legislative seats, and by 2011, they had climbed to 7%, which was their highest ever. And by 2023, they were back down to about 4%. Meaning that after 6 election cycles of democracy, we have ended up almost exactly where we started. So now there's a proposal going through Nigeria's constitutional amendment process to add seats that are reserved only for women. And to understand what it's actually proposing, I want to quickly walk you through how the 3 chambers work right now. So first we have the Senate, which is the upper chamber at the national level. And right now it has 109 seats. And the way that it works is that each of the 36 states is divided into 3 senatorial districts. So each state sends 3 senators plus 1 extra senator for the FCT, which which is Abuja, and that's how you get to 109. What the bill wants to do is add one more seat per state and the FCT exclusively for women, which adds 37 new seats and takes the Senate from 109 to 146. Then we have the House of Representatives, which is the lower chamber, also at the national level, and it has 360 seats. But these ones aren't shared equally between states, they are based on population. So a heavily populated state like Kano has more House members than a smaller state. And what the bill wants to do here is add 2 women-only seats per state and the FCT, which adds another 74 seats and takes the House from 360 to 434. Finally, we have the State Houses of Assembly, which are the individual parliaments that make laws for each state. And altogether across all 36 states, there are currently 991 members. And what the bill wants to do here is add 3 women-only seats per state, which adds another 108 seats and takes the state assemblies from 991 to 1099. So when you add all 3 chambers together, the bill creates 219 new seats reserved exclusively for women across the country. And on the surface, that genuinely sounds like progress, but I want us to actually think about whether it does what it's meant to do. Because even with every single one of those 219 reserved seats filled, women's representation still would not reach the 30% minimum that the United Nations recommends, meaning that the proposal that Nigeria is currently debating doesn't even clear the lowest acceptable bar. Moreover, there's also the fact that we would be paying for a much larger and more expensive set of legislatures, more salaries, more allowances, more running costs at both the national and the state level, for bodies that Nigerians already feel cost far too much without actually getting to what the international standard would consider basic inclusion. So what is the point of all of this? And this brings me back to Money Point's Women in Tech program that I mentioned at the beginning, because it's the same conversation playing out in a different setting. The idea that you can have a women-only program running alongside your main program, or women-only seats running alongside the main ballot and call it inclusion, when what you have actually built is a parallel track that keeps women adjacent to the real power rather than inside it. I'm not saying that programs like this shouldn't exist, but we also need to give women a spot on the main stage. And then there's another point that genuinely unsettles me the most, which is the real risk that these reserved seats get filled not by grassroots women who have been organizing at community level, who are actually in the street, but by the wives and the daughters and the sisters of the same male political godfathers who have controlled Nigerian politics for decades. Because the same structures that kept women out of regular seats are the ones that will decide who fills the reserved ones. And if that happens, you haven't changed representation at all. You've just expanded the nepotism. I wouldn't be Fumi Yakobo if I didn't consider the counter argument, which is, let's even forget the reserved seats. Let women compete on the existing ballot. Let voters elect them. But my response to that is, that's actually reasonable. I'm not going to lie, that is very reasonable, but only in theory. Because we've had 25 years to do exactly that, and across all those election cycles, we went from 3% to 7% and back to 3 point something percent. So the voting pattern has already shown us what it does when left to itself, and the answer is not encouraging. Quick one, there have been some updates to this bill that I did not see during my research. The initial one was 37 Senate seats and 74 House seats, and the House seats were reduced to 37. Then they came back again and they said the 37 Senate seats was too many, so that was reduced to 6, so 1 per geopolitical zone. I know that some of this negates some of my earlier arguments, especially the financial one of the running cost of extra seats, but there are still other arguments that stand, which is the fact that nothing changes structurally, whether that's 6 seats or 37 or 74, it's still the same. And in a few seconds, I'm going to use some countries as case studies, so you'll understand better that it really doesn't matter. Kenya went the reserved seats route, and those seats became exactly what people feared. A parallel track where women were placed, not elected, roles with no real competitive mandates, and no genuine power base. And the structure determined the outcome in exactly the way critics want they would. Because when you design a separate lane, you don't change who controls the main role. On the other hand, Rwanda did something different. Their 2003 constitution set a 30% minimum quota. And what actually happened was that women won 48% in the first election, then 56%. Then 64%. Because the political parties went further than the quota and placed women prominently on candidate slates for regular seats as well, meaning that the whole system was redesigned to produce a different result, rather than just adding a parallel track alongside the existing broken one. And the difference between Kenya and Rwanda isn't the existence of a quota, it's whether the quota is designed to actually solve the problem or to perform like it is. Nigeria is a country that understands visibility, and it's something that we talk about constantly. Like, we see it everywhere, from our artists to our politicians. Like, everybody's is always talking about, Nigeria to the world, Africa to the world, things like that. So we understand it. We understand what it feels like. We understand what it feels like to walk into a room and, you're the only Nigerian there. We understand what it feels like to be on a global stage and you look around and you don't see anyone that looks like you. Because we have lived that experience in London, in San Francisco, in boardrooms and institutions that were never built for us. And we know exactly what erasure feels like because we have felt it. Yet we're a country of over 250 ethnic groups that mostly talks about Wazobia. A country where women are nearly half the population, yet the Senate looks like it forgot. A country where the National Disability Act has been in law for 6 years and over 85% of Nigerian schools are still not accessible to students with disabilities. A country where there is a 5% employment quota for people with disabilities in public service that is largely ignored. A country where you have to go through graduation photos yourself to find out how many women are even in these programs because nobody is keeping that record officially. We want to be seen so bad when we go abroad, and that fight actually matters. But the question I keep asking myself is why we haven't turned that energy inward. Why the same people who feel the weight of being unseen in white spaces are building institutions at home that make entire groups of their own people invisible. And I think it's because visibility abroad feels like something external, something that has been done to us. But visibility at home requires us to look at what we're doing to each other. And I feel like that is just a much harder mirror to stand in front of. And in general, Nigerians are just not that reflective. Pardon my language, I guess, but I just feel like Nigerians don't reflect that hard, if I'm being honest. Nigeria has always had the women. Funmilayo Ransom Kuti was here, Gambo Sawaba was here, Margaret Epo was here, Lois Otta is currently here. We've always had the diversity, we've always had the range, long before any of these institutions existed. So the question has never been whether the people are there. The question is whether the systems we keep building are actually designed to see them, or whether we're going to keep posting graduation photos, passing constitutional amendments, launching women-only programs, and calling it inclusion, while the numbers tell a completely different story. Because visibility is not something we only deserve when we travel, it starts at home.